Welcome to the Polgar Chess University. In this lesson, we'll talk about various things, but especially about the importance of controlling the center. We'll examine a few games of a legend of one of the earliest pioneers in chess, Greco. We'll look at games, in fact 4 games, that were each played in Europe in 1620. That means a long time ago, almost 500 years ago. Pretty incredible, isn't it? Well, let's pick up the first game. We started with e4, e5, knight f3. Of course, I bet you've seen this countless times before, but already here at this early stage of the game, Black responded with certainly a very questionable and in fact wrong plan. The black pawn is under attack right now on e5, but Black most commonly would protect it with the knight on c6. Or instead of knight c6, d6. Or would counterattack with the knight against White's pawn on e4. However, in this game, Black chose to play queen to f6, protecting the pawn this way. Remember, at the early stages of the game, usually it's not a good idea to get your queen into the game. You will see why. White simply continued developing by playing bishop c4, on one hand getting the bishop into the game, and on the other hand preparing to castle to the king's side. Black continued with yet another error by moving the queen another time, moving it to g6. At first it seems not such a bad idea, as now the black queen is attacking the pawn on g2 as well as on e4 simultaneously. The problem comes that after White now castles, which perfectly fits in to White's plans, Black now cannot safely capture the pawn on e4, which they did in the game. But let's see why this is not so good for Black. And this is a typical example that you always need to look out for tactics throughout a chess game, no matter how early or how late into the game. With this last move, Black captured a pawn and attacked White's bishop on c4. But here comes the catch. White sacrifices his bishop on f7 by capturing the black pawn, checking White's king. Now, the point is that if Black accepts the sacrifice, then here comes the fork, and Black loses his queen on e4 after the black king moves out of the check. Therefore, the black king better moves out of the check and does not capture the bishop. The best way to continue was to play king d8. However, the game continued with king e7, which is clearly visibly inferior because it steps right in front of Black's bishop on f8. White continues with rook e1, attacking the black queen immediately, not giving Black the chance to recover from this disorganized, undeveloped position. The queen better goes, went to f4, and now White was ready to capture the pawn on e5 with a check. But you may wonder, what happens if now the black king captures White's bishop? Well, we'll see that right away because that's what happened in the game. But in the meantime, I would like to point out that if the king would now retreat to d8, the game would end immediately because of the checkmate on e8. So, king captured the bishop on f7, and now you can see how with pretty much every move, one after another, White is making aggressive moves, attacking moves, not leaving Black the time to develop his minor pieces or to hide his king in a safe place. So white played d4. Looks like a harmless move, but in reality a very powerful one, opening the diagonal of white's bishop, which now at the same time is attacking the black queen. The black queen retreated to f6, and now yet again an aggressive move, going after black's king immediately. Knight g5 check. The king has only one place to go. To g6, and yet again an ambitious move, queen d3 check. We can see how in a huge trouble the black king is in. If the king would go to h6, that would step onto the same diagonal where white's bishop is, and therefore white could checkmate in one with knight f7, which would be a double check from the bishop as well as from the knight. Therefore, black has no defense, game over. The king moved to h5, which is not much better either. Now white will still checkmate within a few moves, most efficiently playing g4, and then when king captures, queen h3, very nice checkmate. Wow, what a short little game, but it's certainly an excellent example that illustrates what happens when one side ignores the rule, the principle to develop your pieces, and rather starts a premature attack, getting the queen into the game far too early. Okay, let's move on to our next example, which was also played by Greco as white against an unknown opponent. And again, remember, this is played almost 500 years ago, back in 1620. The next game also started with e4, as most games used to in that time of history. And black in this game played e6, which we know today as the French defense. White played d4, controlling, occupying the center, and here today everybody would play d5 automatically, putting the gloves on and ready for a fight for the center. Well, in this game, black certainly played an inferior move by playing knight f6. Now white would have the option immediately to play e5 and chase the knight and gain a little bit of momentum. White played perhaps only a second best move by playing bishop to d3. And now black still should be playing d5, fight for the center. But again, black played a different move, knight c6. White continued developing and protecting the pawn on d4 at the same time. Black yet again did not play d5 but played bishop e7. And here the game became rather interesting, and I'd like to show you this idea because it's very important that you get familiar with it. A, you may win some nice games with it, and B, making sure you don't fall into this famous trap. White played h4, which is obviously a rather committing move, because once you play h4, it's a clear signal that you're out to go after the opponent's king, you're out to go for an immediate and early attack. When you play h4, you would rarely castle yourself afterwards to the king's side, because the whole purpose of castling is to hide between your pawns that are on the second rank, or maybe just one of them on the third rank. But you certainly normally would not want to castle to the side where your pawns are all advanced to the fourth rank or beyond. However, at the same time, this is a quite tricky move. Black still should be thinking of moving the d-pawn to d6 or d5, fighting for the center, instead of castling. At the first look, you may think that but black played all normal moves following opening principles. However, in addition to developing your pieces early in the game, it's also rather important that you don't give up the fight of controlling the center. Now white's attack is overwhelming. Comes e5, attacking the knight, and then when the knight moves to d5, white is ready for action, and on a higher level, black's game is already lost. Pretty amazing. Bishop h7, a very famous sacrifice that we see in many different openings. Of course, now black would delay the end by simply accepting the fact that white captured a pawn and not to accept the sacrifice. But black, especially in those days, didn't know yet how deadly this sacrifice is and accepted the gift. Now black is up in material, however, white's attack is a killer. White continued with knight g5, check. And now black has a number of places to go. If the king goes to h8, that's the clearest of them all, then the check comes. And then when the king has only one place to go, immediately checkmate. Let's go back. After knight g5 check, if the king comes to h6, white can choose whether to capture on e6, and that's a discovered check, while attacking black's queen at the same time, or capture on f7 with similar ideas. Then if the bishop would capture on g5, then the point is, and that's how white is taking advantage of the fact that it didn't castle early but kept his rook in its initial square on h1, all of a sudden the h-file had opened, and without white making a single move with the rook, that very rook became a very important part of the attack. And we'll get back to that in a moment because this is what happened in the game. But before we do that, let's talk for a moment about some yet other king moves. For example, king g8 would also be answered by now, queen h5. Or king g6, the king would be chased further by h5, and now if king f5, the checkmate arrives with a pawn move. So let's go back to this position where the game continued with bishop takes knight, pawn takes back, remember discovery. And now if the king moves back, the queen again doubles up together with the rook. Now white threatens to checkmate with either queen h7 or queen h8. And black could only solve this problem temporarily by opening up the f7 square for the king. So if now queen checks, then the king indeed could escape at least for a little bit. But it's more precise to just play g6 quietly, preventing the escape of black's king on f7. Now we can see how black is helpless against white's threats. The game itself continued with the black king going to g6 and white responding with queen h5 check, chasing the king further out, king f5, and now white has several ways to win the game. The most precise one is to check immediately on h3, because then black cannot avoid checkmate on the very next move. For example, if king e4, can you see the checkmate? And here it comes, queen d3. Or if the king goes backwards, then the checkmate arrives from h7. Very nice. And finally, the game itself ended with queen h7. Black blocked the check, and then white realized that it's time to go to h3 and give the same checkmate idea that we've seen a minute ago. Another beautiful game. It showed you how it's important to fight for the center from the very first moves on. It's important to have at least one of your pawns in the center, or these type of troubles can happen. Let's move on and see another example, also by the famous chess pioneer Greco. White played e4 again, and black again ignored controlling the center and played b6, d4, bishop b7. attacking white's pawn on e4, and white protected the pawn with the bishop. And now black tried a tricky move, and this is a rather famous opening trap that is good to know not to fall into. Black played f5. The idea of the move is that it attacks the pawn on e4 a second time, and then when and if white captures, then black captures all of a sudden on g2, with the idea to then trap white's rook on h1. This famous miniature game is a perfect example why it's considered that the f7 is the weakest point in black's position in the beginning part of the game, because when that pawn is gone, all of a sudden the king can get in major trouble in that diagonal e8 through h5. White now would continue with queen h5 check. Black has only one move to block the check. Pawn captures. We can already see trouble, how this pawn now threatens to move forward, open up the queen's diagonal towards the black king, and that would be checkmate. For example, if now bishop takes rook, pawn advance, and it is a checkmate. Let's go back. But what happens if black now responds with knight f6? That's a tricky move because it does attack the white queen on h5. And then if the queen moves away, then already the black bishop would capture the white rook on h1. However, it's white to move and to checkmate in 2 moves only. And the answer is pawn takes pawn, discover check again. Black has only one legal move, capturing white's queen, and voila, game over, it's checkmate. I suggest you listen to this lesson again and especially focus in on the key parts of these little games. Well, the lesson is not quite over yet though. We have one more Greco game to see, again from 1620. And here we go. e4, black again played b6, d4, bishop b7, and bishop d3. So far exactly the same as game 3 of this lesson. And in this game black played the so-called double fianchetto, developing the second bishop to the side as well. And white got a full presence in the center, playing f4, bishop g7, bishop e3, protecting the pawn on d4, knight c6, and knight f3. I think white is a little bit overexpanding because now black could play moves like knight b4, going after the white bishop, and then if that bishop moves, then the pawn on e4 can be unprotected. So I would be more careful, and probably playing the f4 move I would consider unnecessary. So let's go back, and now came after knight f6, which was the game move. Again, I would focus on solidifying my position, probably playing c3 with the pawn, preventing the knight b4 idea, but white played c4. It's great to have a complete control of the center, but obviously it delays the development of some other pieces or of castling. So therefore, it certainly wouldn't be my top choice. Again, as of black, I would look to play knight b4 right now, in hopes that now the pawn on e4 is attacked by 2 pieces. So therefore, white would need to play e5. But at least black would get to trade a knight for a bishop, which is somewhat of a good news. At the same go, white has an amazing position in the center, and white is still better here. So after c4, black has castled, and look at this beautiful setup that white has here with a ideal development of the 2 bishops as well as the 2 knights, and having an amazing center position with all 4 pawns controlling center squares. Black now continued with e6, and white finally advanced e5, knight e8, and here I would say white could play more conservatively and maintain a better position. White could play d5, white could castle, bunch of good ideas. White played kind of unnecessarily risky, I would say. White played g4. And black responded with d5. It's very famous advice that when your opponent attacks on the side, counterattack in the middle of the board. And that's exactly what black is doing. However, after the exchange of pawns, black didn't play precisely. Black here should have played knight b4, which is a tricky move, with the idea to then capture with a piece on d5 and not a pawn. The importance of that is that if black will have a pawn on that d5 square, the bishop on b7 will be greatly limited in its activity. The point of this black move would be that after pawn takes pawn, black could capture with a check the white bishop, and when queen recaptures, black would win a piece, white's knight. So after cd5, black made a mistake in recapturing with a pawn, and now white has again several good ways to play. Simply expand further by playing f5 and then f6 with a humongous attack, or play as they did by playing h4. I'd like you to pay attention how now white develops a deadly attack. And black, well, there's not too much that black can do, but certainly black could play better than they did in the game by playing a6. White played h5. Now white's goal is to simply open the h file, utilize that the white rook is still on that file, just like we saw in game 2, and get the queen onto that same h file to prepare a mating attack. Black played b5, and now it was time to open the h file. Well, let's see what would happen if black would recapture with the f pawn. In that case, white would immediately play knight g5, attack on h7, and at the same time prepare a fork by moving the knight to e6. Black's position is quite miserable here as well. After pawn takes on g6, black recaptured with a pawn, and now the plan is simple. We want our queen on the h file. Therefore, it needs to go on the second rank. And almost regardless how black reacts, whether attacks our knight or not, the queen appears on h2. We can see how deadly the situation is. The checkmate is about to come. In fact, black in the game captured the knight and checkmate arrived. Or, if black instead of capturing the knight would have played f6, trying to open up a little escape route, white has several good ways to react, whether pushing the pawn up to e6, controlling that f7 square, or capturing the pawn on g6. Both would put black in front of unsolvable problems. Well, what did we see? What's common between these 4 games by Greco other than all 4 were played in 1620? Well, white started with a king-pawn start in all 4 games and played pretty common sense chess, developing the pieces, controlling the center, and striking when the opportunity opened up. What was the mistake of black in all of these 4 games? Black did not pay enough attention in controlling the center. Black was worried too much about kind of randomly developing his pieces, even though kind of towards the center, but yet without any pawn presence there. And also we saw several interesting attacking ideas. 2 of the games involved opening the h file, and those are especially common when black plays with g6 and develop the bishop to g7. Always when you see that, Keep in mind that as an option to either withhold castling a little bit or castle sometimes to the queen side, the longer side of the board, and then to play h4, utilize your rook that is in an ideal attacking position on h1 and try to get your queen on h2 on the same h-file to help create a dangerous attack. Well, I hope you enjoyed this lesson and learned some, and be back next week for some more chess ideas. Thank you for listening. Bye. Until next time.